The speakers have put so well, I think, that right now we're in the situation where we have misconceptions, to say the least, around poverty and a whole range of things, from my perspective in particular, from my work, poverty and social security, and how they have, I think, genuinely become these myths sort of ingrained in British culture, and even more worryingly, I think, into British politics. And I think over the past 6 years, we have seen this emergence of what we can call maybe the big benefit myth. Thank you. This idea that there is such a thing as a benefit class in this country now, and that given half the chance, this class will suck every pound it can from the benefit system. And more than that, the system itself is now completely out of control, and it is willfully handing out all this taxpayers' money to anyone who can fill in a simple form and give a good sob story at the job centre. I think disabled people, maybe more than anyone, have found themselves sort of smack in the middle of this myth and are having to live with the consequences of that myth. When you look at what is actually happening, you see things like the abolition of disability living allowance. That's the benefit that helps disabled people pay for the extra costs of disability. That's now been scrapped. The consequences of that is that thousands of disabled people are losing their right to that benefit and are, as we speak, having things like mobility cars and scooters and wheelchairs being repossessed. Things like the Independent Living Fund, which help pay for people's personal assistance so they didn't have to live in care homes, have been abolished, while social care cuts are leaving disabled people around 100,000 at a minimum without the support to get out of bed in the morning or even go to the toilets. Things like employment and support allowance, famously linked to the work capability assessment, which I'll talk a bit about later, now has things like time limits attached to it, where your illness hasn't been cured, but the government stops your money after a year anyway. The bedroom tax, that now famous policy that cuts your housing benefits if you're deemed by the DWP to have a spare bedroom, has pushed thousands of the poorest disabled people into rent arrears, penalising them for needing a box room to store wheelchairs and oxygen cylinders, or to have somewhere for their carer and partner to sleep in. And over halfway into a decade of these cuts, no other group in the country has taken a bigger financial burden than disabled people. When you look at the big stats behind it, disabled people and disabled people in poverty have been hit by government cuts 18 times harder than the average citizen. 18 times. And that, I think, for most of us should be nothing less than a national scandal. But perhaps the most striking thing is that actually the government hasn't even bothered to try and hide that to a great degree. Because the thing is, they haven't had to. From the early days of the coalition right up to the present government, each measure to cut the so-called bloated welfare bill has been somewhat proudly announced as some sort of prudent economic decision, to the point where the cut, whatever that is usually deemed as a complete necessity. And that, I think, is the scary power of this big benefit myth, that actually cutting what is, over 5 years, £28 billion worth of support from people like cancer patients and paraplegics can actually be sold to the public as the right thing to do. I think this myth gets particularly powerful when you see things like Tory politicians on the screen earlier, to classic Daily Mail headlines, are selling us not only this economic argument, but are going on what I think can only be described as some sort of strange moral mission. It isn't just, these are tough economic times and we don't have a choice in this. It's actually, this choice is the fair one. It's not only that people like disabled people, or indeed large working class families, or the unemployed, are deemed too costly, but they are a cost the rest of society shouldn't have to pay. I think when you look at the sort of TV shows that you get on mainstream media now, you can call it something like the white D threat. The idea that sort of a few years after the recession and in a growing anti-benefit climate, it's far from bankers or tax avoiders or low-paying tax businesses. It's actually the people receiving benefits who have been the ones milking the state. We'll remember a few years ago George Osborne's infamous speech about the people with their curtains still drawn at midday as their hard-working neighbours get up and go to work. I think that was really the root and the start of this ongoing sort of moral message that actually in this country there are some people doing the so-called right thing and then there are others doing the wrong thing. And it's here I think that disabled people have become both an incredibly strange target but also a really logical one. There's surely no bigger burden on the taxpayer than the people who are supposedly getting these free cars, this lifetime of easy benefits, and all these endless perks. If you watch Stephen Hawking or Paralympians go and get to work, and you think, well, logically, everyone else just needs to try a little bit harder. Disabled people have fallen within the cracks of a climate, I think, that is increasingly viewing social and economic disadvantage as some sort of sign of individual failure. We see this sort of emergence of the undeserving sick, where even being chronically ill or disabled is somehow a matter of personal responsibility. And this cultural shift has had tangible, widespread consequences. It's not only given free rein to a pretty seismic cuts to disability benefits, but also unprecedented regressive changes to how they are assessed. I think that's when we can look at something like the now notorious work capability assessment or fit for work tests. So these are the tests that are meant to determine whether someone essentially needs an out-of-work sickness benefit or whether they are physically or mentally capable of holding down a job. And we've seen these assessments very famously now make lots of headlines, declaring anyone from coma patients, so I think the last one this week was a guy who had part of his head and skull missing, to be fit for work. And these people are apparently quite capable of getting out of bed in the morning and working 50 plus hours a week. And this is a test that not only is declaring people that are quite obviously not capable of work as fit for work, but when we look at the studies behind it, this is actually a test that has been proven to make disabled and chronically ill people worse. Over 60% of disabled and ill people put through this test report being in pain afterwards. I think you look at something like that and it can really only be called some sort of culture of cruelty at this point. The DWP have just released details of the deaths of at least 49 people who have died, many of them through suicide, after going through the benefit system. You see reports in job centres of far from this idea of walking in, filling in a quick form and walking out with a fortune, that actually you have systems like the benefit sanction system that means that people's benefits can be removed very swiftly, leading them in what can only be described as devastating hardship. We know of one pregnant woman with mental health problems that you might have seen in the news who, after having her benefits stopped, had to walk 2 miles to a food bank. She was pregnant as she was doing that. Her last baby was stillborn, and the DWP sanctioned her when she found it too difficult to leave her flat for a job interview. A young man with learning difficulties was sanctioned for being 4 minutes late for the job centre, despite the fact that his disability meant he couldn't tell the time. He was found by neighbours sitting in his flat in the dark with no electricity, gas or food. Every week for work I talk to people who are physically reliant on benefits, and they're reliant on them in various ways, often because they are working, but they need additional support for basic things like buying a wheelchair or hiring a PA, or they're simply too ill to be able to even earn an income. And they're far from living a life of luxury. They're far from laughing at the system. Generally, they are actually incredibly afraid. They're afraid of people in the street who randomly abuse them because they are walking with a crutch. They're mainly afraid, I think, of the Department for Work and Pensions, that idea of the brown envelope arriving on the doormat and the latest cuts coming to take the money that they're relying on to live. I think we hear a lot about the mythical benefit scroungers. We hear a lot about the mythical, to a large extent, benefit fraudsters. But half of the battle is talking about people who actually are sort of the reality behind these myths. I remember an email I got from a woman last year in her 40s called Michelle. That's not her real name because, like most people I speak to, she told me she was too ashamed for people to know who she was. Michelle told me that quite casually that she hadn't eaten in 4 days, and her disability benefits were late going into her bank account, something that happens very frequently with the DWP. They were late going into her bank account, and she couldn't buy any food. And because her local authority, due to social care cuts, hadn't provided her with any support, she was physically stuck due to her disability in the house. So she couldn't even get outside to go to a food bank. Another woman I spoke to, called Sarah, told me that she couldn't eat solid foods, which meant that she didn't have the energy to work. She's one of those so-called scroungers who has a life of Riley by not doing a day's work. Her only income is therefore her disability benefits. And she's one of those classic examples of how hard it is to have any sort of basic existence, let alone a life, when you're just scrabbling by on very limited social security. She told me by the time she's paid her bills that she has literally nothing left. And related to the other discussions earlier, she took out a £900 doorstep loan because of that. And they're now charging her £1,000 interest. She told me she doesn't put the heating on anymore, although she's looking forward to the summer, because normally by 7 p.m. she's just in bed, huddled up with her dog, because it's the only way to keep warm. In a climate of low pay and high rents and insecure jobs and many other struggles, I think it's really, really easy for most people to forget the reality behind these big benefit myths. It becomes easy to believe that actually £100 a week after dealing with Atos for months is some sort of diamond-studded gold. But actually, I think, to end on a vaguely optimistic note, I do think it is a myth that the country is quite capable of rejecting. I think we're quite ready to reject it, and that it's something that politicians and the media and events just like this are more than capable of doing together. Thank you.